Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl. Welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt. Today I'll be speaking with Dr. Michelle Drapkin, who is a clinical psychologist in New Jersey and owns and operates the Cognitive Behavior Therapy Center. She's worked in universities and in the private healthcare sector and is a clinician and trainer and author. In fact, she recently wrote the wonderful book, The Motivational Interviewing Path to Personal Change, the essential workbook for creating the life you want. I know Michelle through the Motivational Interviewing network of trainers, where we've both been members since 2007, 2008. We had a great chat about health and well-being, change and action, and self-compassion. She offered many insights into the path to personal change. And so I bring you Dr. Michelle Drapkin. Dr. Michelle Drapkin, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Thank you. I dressed for the occasion, Stan.
I love it. I love it. Self-compassion. I've worn a blank T-shirt. I've let myself down, but yes.
Yeah.
Well, I should be more.
I'm taking over your podcast. That's what we're
Yeah,
here
yeah.
to talk about.
You are compassion in a T-shirt. Well, actually, yeah, as you know, I'm particularly interested in the idea of self-compassion. And so, which is kind of being sensitive to one's own suffering and being committed to trying to alleviate that suffering. And so there is an action or change part to self-compassion, doing something that's helpful, I guess, with respect to health and well-being and so on. But it's difficult. Behavior change is difficult. And I wondered whether we could start there, like why is it so difficult to make these sort of helpful changes in our lives, the barriers and so on, even though we know at some level that the change might be good for us?
It is so hard, and I'm not sure that there's an easy answer. Even as you were talking, I was like, oh, where are we gonna where can we go? And there's so many different ways. I think the my mind says that the quickest answer is the fact that we think so quickly. And a lot of that happens outside of our awareness.
Okay.
And if we were to stop and think, we would make more consistent behavior choices in line with our values. It's just we're doing a lot of stuff out of our conscious awareness. And I don't want you to think I'm like Freudian and I'm talking about, but there is this piece that I just think actually the spin I sort of put on it is like, how amazing is it that our brains are so amazing and they're just doing all of this stuff all the time. And yet it's happening outside of our conscious awareness. We could pull it in and we can make ourselves more aware, which is a big piece of the self-compassion movement, right? That mindful awareness. And we just don't do it as often as we could. And so we get ourselves into pickles and we're sort of halfway down doing the behavior that we don't want to do before we realize it. And I think that's one of the challenges. And then it just creates a cycle of then we beat ourselves up and then there's like negative affect around it and we just dig our hole. If we just slow down, and I think it's part and parcel. I don't know. I'd be curious what you think about it. I think it's gotten worse. I think technology and oh, maybe this is a good time to out myself that I've finally started watching. I am not on TikTok, and I avoided TikTok for a really long time, but I started watching the reels on like Instagram or they show up in other social media. And my 12-year-old will be like, Mom, are you watching this again? I'm like, I am. I don't even know how it happened. I don't want it to happen. It's so like mindless. But she has to catch me. She's almost like creating that awareness for me of you're doing something that like, what is that? That's not consistent with like your values, or you're wasting 20, 30 minutes or maybe even more just watching this inane stuff. And it happened. And I didn't even notice it. I needed her to kind of tap me on the shoulder. And I think that's a big piece of just the stuff we get in these habits or this pathway, and the train is gone before we realize we're 3 stops down.
Mm. Only 20 or 30 minutes on Insta Reels. That you sound like you're doing pretty well.
Yeah, that's right. Well, yes. And you know what I think that is? That's the pot calling the kettle black, right?
Oh,
She's 12-year-old preteen, and I'm always watching her use of devices. And she's sort of like, what the heck? What the heck are
mm,
you doing there?
yeah. No,
So that's sort of the piece of it.
I really appreciate that place where you've started there. Actually, I was almost anticipating we'd be talking about kind of little practical barriers and things like that, but actually the foundation really is this mind awareness piece. You know, that we have a whole mixture of thoughts, but we also have all of these feelings and different motivations and so on that are all happening, often quite outside our awareness, and yet having a very powerful influence on what we do next, sort of thing. And
Hmm.
without, so the first step almost is really creating awareness around the mind and what it's doing and how it's influencing things. And you sort of phrase it in a very positive way, that the mind is a wonderful thing, how it can do all of this. And the
Hmm.
CFT's compassion focused therapy version of that is, therefore it's not our fault, sort of thing. It's not our fault that our mind is so in default mode sometimes. But
Hmm.
can we slow down? Can we create a calmness, a kind of an awareness, and move from there?
Well, and can we stop if we take that compassionate stance, can we then stop some of the negative affects? So when we catch it, we're just like, oh, that makes sense. My mind went down that pathway. It's kind of the way the metaphor I use when I'm talking with patients or just anyone who's thinking about behavior change is like, that's a really smooth pathway. It's like
Mm,
grease down. You're like, boom, I went down it. And when you notice that you're halfway down, can you have some compassion and self-compassion for yourself and just be like, well, it makes sense. That's what I
mm,
always used to do. Makes total sense that that happened. And then pull yourself back and think, all right, and what do I want to do instead? Which pathway is more consistent with who I want to be? Okay, that one. It's a little clunky though. It's kind of it has a bunch of weeds and I still need to like trim it down and make it smooth. That's hard. Again, compassion. And so it's really just kind of like I see compassion showing up in various places for us to be able to stay motivated. And I don't know what you think about this. This is something I think a lot about, and I've been saying this a lot lately. And so but I'm not exactly sure where I get it from or if there's data to support it. That there's a piece of me that thinks anecdotally, and from the work that I've done over the past 20 years, that initiating behavior change is somewhat easier than maintaining. And that once you get into like it's like, oh, I'm cutting down the trees. Here I go. I'm starting this behavior change. Isn't this fun? Like it's like a puzzle you're solving or it's something that the engagement is there. And then once it happens, you lose sort of that oomph to keep yourself in the game. And I think there's almost a second process that needs to happen for maintenance as
mm,
opposed to initiation of behavior change.
mm,
That's something I've been toying with lately, just kind of noodling on like what's going on there and why do I think that way? I'm not sure. I feel
mm.
like this is now I'm interviewing you, Stan. What do you think about that?
Well, it's a really interesting point, actually, because yeah, behavior change is difficult, and we sort of talked about that, but maintaining change is kind of really difficult as well, and it is something about how the motivation might be there to make the change. There might even be some reward or reinforcement initially. The people around us are encouraging us, and or it sort of feels good to have made the change, or somehow or other it's sort of reinforced, and then that starts to fade away, and we get to the reality of what it is to now be a non-smoker or be an exercising person, and then the harder slog begins, and it's sort
Yeah.
of we can be a bit at risk of slipping.
Yeah. And again, it's that awareness, right? That
Mm,
awareness of, I was just talking with a new patient who I'm, just 3 sessions in, and he's doing really well, alcohol use disorder, and we were talking about that of just, well, what, and he's like, oh no, I got this. And I was like, all right. And there might be a time where it just by accident, it shows back up again, that behavior, and you find yourself having a drink and it happens, right? It
mm,
absolutely happens. And it's because that really smooth pathway is there. And actually, that stuff we know from, our animal behavior science research, right? Of just spontaneous remission of or recovery of various behaviors. And so I often think that way. Like, listen, we're just really complicated animals. And if we see that rats do this in a cage, we're going to do it. It might look differently, or it might be more complicated or further down the road. And it's possible that if you just something happens and you kind of slip back, and not to be catastrophic or pessimistic, it's just being prepared, right?
Mm.
For the possibility, and how do we prevent recurrence of behaviors, because it is so hard, right? So it's so hard. And so you would think once I get over the hump of the hill, I'm done. I'm not sure that's true. And so I
Mm.
think, but that's compassion, right? It's more compassion of an acceptance of this is part of the process. And so how do we manage and integrate this into our schema for behavior change?
Yeah, we have tricky brains. We're sort of we're just another animal with these tricky brains that evolved, in certain directions, and out of all of that comes a lot of suffering. I mean, there is a lot of profound, sort of strengths and positives, and it's all about survival and reproduction, but it also comes along with suffering as well. And actually,
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting you say that, because earlier on you mentioned the role of self-criticism, and that we might make a change, and then we might be battling away at maintaining that change, but then there's a slip or a lapse or something like that, and then in comes the mind again. Now it's maybe critical of ourselves that we haven't maintained
Mm-hmm.
that change. What do you make of that
Yeah.
bit?
Well, I think about that's, there's an inner critic, or there's various voices, or like, what's wrong with you? In fact, actually, so I'll out myself that at some point, I discovered as a parent that was like my favorite phrase, is what's wrong with you, to my daughter. And
Mm.
I can't remember if it was my thoughtful husband, who's fairly mindfully aware and he's an engineer, Stan, so he's like a little bit more, balanced and like like rational. And I think he might have pointed out to me. In fact, we created a acronym for it, which is WEY. So it makes it kind of funnier of like, well, it comes out often. And so it's what is wrong with you spells WEY.
Mm.
But I mentioned that because there was this piece of, I was really beating myself up of why would I say that to my daughter like all the time?
Mm.
What's wrong with you? And I
Mm.
realized it came from what I grew up with, or what I would say to myself of, well, what's wrong with you? Why can't you get this behavior under control? Why can't you finally work out and be in good shape and just stick with it? Like, what's wrong with you? Right. And this is
Mm.
just the language that I use for myself. And I think catching that, though, and having the benefit of a supportive family to help me to reflect that back really helped me see, well, this is how you're talking to yourself. And that's actually not really helpful to talk to myself or my child who's developing and growing, to say that kind of stuff to her either.
Mm.
And I think that, again, it's sort of that stopping and having this mirror of someone reflecting it back to you, or you being able to reflect it back to yourself, and listening to how you talk to yourself,
Mm.
which is why I wrote a self-help book, right? So you see, it's like, this is exactly it. This is what we're teaching people to do in a lot of our work. And so if we could just teach them to do it, or facilitate it for them in a book, great. That just creates access to a really amazing treatment intervention paradigm, in a book for like
Mm.
$25, right? It's
Mm.
25 US dollars.
That's right.
But very affordable, right? And so um, I think that's kind of a long-winded answer of what I'm thinking about, of this voice, but it's bringing that awareness. And then so first step is knowing it's there. And the second step is having a conversation of it. Well, what function do you serve? What's the value of why you're there? And then how do I have some compassion for you, voice? Because you're
Mm.
there and you're part of me. And then it must mean something. And so when I'm saying what's wrong with you to myself, it's because I want to do better. And
Mm.
if I want to be a better person, I want to be a healthier person, I want to be more consistent with those behaviors. But talking to myself like that actually doesn't help. And so guess what? Talking to my kid like that also doesn't help. And so how do you figure out how to notice those things, have some compassion for them, and move in the direction of changing even the way we talk to ourselves.
Mm. Yeah, gosh, there's a lot in there that you've just said. I had a gaming weekend last weekend with a bunch of me old mates. Now I'm outing myself, but anyway, and one of them is a psychologist too, and we sort of knew each other from uni, and we sort of stumbled across this little conversation where he was saying that he hates gardening, whereas I really quite
Mm.
enjoy gardening. It's a bit of a relaxation time, and we sort of realized that when he was a child, if he was being punished for some reason, he was punished by being told to go and weed the garden.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas when I was a kid, we had this little thing where I would get a center root. In other words, if I could pull a weed and it had a root on the bottom, I'd get a cent. And then, like if I got 100
Oh.
weeds, I'd get $1 sort of thing. And we thought to ourselves, like, isn't that interesting? Just the way that we're shaped by those early life experiences. It just gets in
Mm-hmm.
there, and it's nothing we got to choose or ourselves, and it's nothing particularly devastating in terms of the various parents and so on. But it is just interesting how our early life experiences go on to shape us, and that's sort of what you're describing as well. These little automatic behaviors that just arise out of our experiences and how we were shaped, and one of those is often that self-critical piece as well, that we
Mm-hmm.
end up being kind of a bit hard on ourselves when we sort of do something that's sort of not right or not good enough or whatever it might
Mm-hmm.
be. And so the other thought I had was that in a funny sort of way, self-compassion weaves all the way through it. Self-compassion is a little bit at the start when we're trying to become more aware of our own minds. We're trying to make choices that are sort of in our own interests or health and well-being and so on. But self-compassion's at the back end too, when we lapse or slip, or when we start to criticize ourselves. And how can we come in with a more self-compassionate self-relating too? So it's interesting. It sort of does weave through all of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan. That's why I was delighted when you asked me to join you here because I love self-compassion, and that's why I included it, in the book, in a book on behavior change, because I
Mm,
often think that's one of the barriers to successful behavior changes. There's not a healthy acceptance for how difficult it is. It should be easier, right? There's a lot of this shoulding. It
yeah.
should be easier. Like, what's wrong with me? I'm a smart person. And it's just taking a step back, and especially for us overachievers, right? Who are like perfectionists and really successful. It's hard for us to give ourselves a break, and we don't even notice how much we're beating ourselves up in that
Mm.
process and in that journey, and then we wind up exhausted, frustrated, and not changing and stuck. And
Ah,
so it's,
yeah.
yeah, how do we keep that, keep people engaged? And I think part of it, which I got to know, I mean, I got to imagine that you have this conversation often with compassion and self-compassion, is people like people who, especially who are like overachievers, kind of like tough on the outside, really driven people, don't want to be nice to themselves. That's not like how
Mm,
they've been shaped. Especially thinking about corporate environments and, high achieving, tough. It feels like you're being soft
mm,
and you're just letting people be too easy. And a lot of times it's I have to really work at describing it to someone, of it's not, you're not giving yourself a break. It's you're giving yourself the compassion to say, like, this makes sense. This is what's showing up, and it's telling me a little bit about what's important to me in a lot of ways, and I can use this self-compassion to breathe, regulate myself, and move forward. And it's always like both of those. It's not, you're not going to stay stuck here with like your hands over your heart for an hour in the corner.
mm,
Like, you're going to stay here, give yourself a break, and move forward for what's important to you, stronger, more confident, and more balanced.
mm,
Feeling that you can kind of really lean into that. At least I think,
mm.
I mean, that's the way. But I do get a lot of pushback from,
Yeah.
well, actually, I'll out myself again. Maybe we'll call this the confession hour.
Okay.
Compassion confession hour. The first time I heard Kristen Neff talk, I was at the Association for Contextual Behavioral Sciences. I don't know if you were there, the World Conference in Seattle,
No.
and she gave a plenary, packed room. And I can't remember what year it was, but it was, and anyway, she was there and she gave her self-compassion talk, did the whole little exercise. And I was like, what is this junk? What is this? Putting my hand over my heart. I was, ugh. I was a little, and actually I share that story a little bit in the book because I want to sort of normalize, I want to have compassion for the reaction to self-compassion. It's like meta self-compassion. And
Yes.
afterwards, my good friend, Dr. Jill Stoddard, who is an acceptance and commitment therapy trainer and author and is amazing, was there. And I was like, she's like, oh, I really liked it. And I was like, oh, all right, well, I don't know if Jill likes it. And then I kept trying it again. I kept reading it, and I'm a scientist. So I'm like, oh, this stuff appears to work in the science. And so let me learn more about it. And now I love it. And I will often share with folks that this is my soothing touch is I go with the classic two hands over the heart, which is my shirt. Ironically, I didn't have it made. I found it at Whole Foods, um, but I think it's tough for some people to think about self-compassion as effective and functional because they're so used to beating themselves up or having someone else kind of beat them up to get them to do the thing they need to do. And punishment sometimes feels like a much more effective strategy when it's really not. Like we know that from the science, right? We know that. But it's a tough thing to get people to come alongside with.
Yes, there's often various forms of blocks and resistances, isn't there, to sort of to self-compassion and to some of the
Yeah.
actions that we might take with self-compassion. It is good to find the way in that suits the person because a lot of men I work with don't really feel that the hand on the heart works for them so much, but there might be something else that is sort of a way in. But yes, it is interesting to work around those resistances there. But it's kind of it's a part of motivational interviewing, really, isn't it? The whole idea of working with resistance, working with discord, looking at the arguments against change or action and so on. I mean, you have written this wonderful book, The Motivational Interviewing Path to Personal Change, the essential workbook for creating the life you want.
It's a mouthful.
And so, yeah, tell us about the book then. How's that all set up? And
Sure. So I never thought I would write a book. I left a faculty role at the University of Pennsylvania, citing the fact that I didn't like to write. So,
okay.
um, so when I was approached to write a book on motivational interviewing, I thought, oh, well, that I know MI, I've done MI, I'm really pretty passionate about motivational interviewing, but I'd always wanted to sort of put together what I think about is my best of, right? It's sort of like my best of interventions but woven in a motivational interviewing framework. And so for folks who don't know what motivational interviewing is, it's really just, which I imagine much of your audience has listened to you talk about motivational interviewing, but if they haven't heard, it's really just a style. It's a way of having conversations and communications. It's very supportive and accepting and partnering. As opposed to telling someone what to do, you help them find what's inside them, their motivation inside to do the thing, and empower them to do it, which sounds amazing, but generally involves two people having a conversation. So writing a self-help book felt a little wonky, and I wasn't sure I could pull it off, to be honest. And I just thought through, well, what if I do this in my own way? And so I wrote the book, and it's in my voice. I don't read the audiobook though. But which if you spend 2 minutes with me, you would know it's very different. But I wrote the book, it's in my voice, and it's as if we're on this journey together. But it doesn't stop with just like what is motivational interviewing. It has all of these other components of, you know, what I call sort of the cognitive behavioral therapy umbrella, right? So I think about CBT as this big umbrella, and under it are all of these evidence-based treatments, and there's kernels of various evidence-based treatments. So we've already talked about self-compassion shows up in there. A little tiny bit of dialectical behavior therapy. Wise Mind is in there, which is one of my favorite tools, some mindfulness is in there, of course. Um, and some acceptance and commitment therapy and like other things that basic CBT, like relapse prevention is in there as well. And so it's kind of this journey in a very consistent way that helps someone figure out what, first of all, starting, and I think this is what makes it a little bit different. And actually, I really had to work with the publisher to help make sure they understood that this is where it was coming from, is we don't start, because motivational interviewing doesn't start with a plan. We start with really like, what's your why, right? If like, what's important to you? What are your values? Who do you want to be? And then where is the gap between who you want to be and where you currently are? Okay, now let's look for some targets and strategies. And then once we figure out those targets, then we come up with we really consolidate the motivation around there, and then we come up with a plan. And it's almost like the plan's like all the way at the end, right? Which you and I know from doing motivational interviewing, but it's really a different way. I mean, think about any other or many other self-help books or books you read, you pick it up and it's all like, here's how to do it. It's like the step-by-step process. And I find that challenging in a couple different levels, and partially because it's invalidating. It makes it sound so easy, right? Oh, you have a problem? You have a behavioral problem? Let's habit stack it. That's super easy. Let's just stack it up and with listen, that is a good tool or strategy, but it's not that easy, right? And if it were, people would have done it already. And so that was kind of the frame of, well, how do we help people leverage some of the evidence-based tools that we all have at our disposal in a way to help them live the life that they want to live?
I love how you start the book with motivational what? Because sometimes people do balk a little bit at the term, don't they?
Oh yeah. Well, that's why I balked at the title of the book because when you read it, it is not the title I would have chosen. I wouldn't have led with
Ah,
motivational interviewing. I think for people like people who we know who know motivational interviewing, they're like, this is amazing. And there's so many other people who just don't understand what it is. And so they'll walk past it. And I thought it had a broader audience and a more engaging title might have
mm,
might have been more helpful.
yeah.
But listen, it's not terrible. I think the cover is really lovely. I love the cover.
Yeah, yeah, no,
But
I wasn't really saying that to sort of feel like it was the wrong words to use, but more just that it's great to start there, I think, like it
hmm
sort of it piques people's curiosity, like what is motivational interviewing? And
hmm
it's an interesting kind of term or phrase or name for the approach. In some ways, it's particularly interesting in the context of a self-help book because, as you say, usually motivational living is done as a conversation between, sort of
hmm
two people, the motivational interviewing person and the person who might be thinking about change. But in the case of a self-help book, well, I suppose the reader becomes both of those roles, and there's a
hmm
part of them that is the therapist or practitioner, and there's a part of them that is the one a bit stuck or ambivalent, and the conversation kind of goes on, but within them across these different
hmm
parts.
Well, at some point in my career, I figured out that we don't. Let me see if I could say this without sounding like too terrible, but like I was gonna
Mm.
say we don't really matter as psychologists or therapists, right? And I don't mean that. That's pretty extreme. But what I mean is when a patient shows up and I'm working with them through their behavior change, I really genuinely believe I'm really just facilitating their own work. And I'm like a guide on that journey or whatever metaphor. And I mean I matter, but it's really them. And so and I'm really just helping them do the work and empower them to do the work in a way that makes sense to them, right? And so all in there feels like, oh, well, in some ways that's kind of a natural opportunity for self-help of like, well, how do we create and structure it in a way that they can help themselves? But I mean, it wasn't easy for sure. And when I was sitting thinking, well, I mean, particularly when we get to kind of the technical components of motivational interviewing, how do you teach someone what change talk is and how to elicit it and to do it in a way that's effective and might actually be helpful and a strategy to do that in a book. It's like, I mean, I spent a lot of time really noodling over these things, and there were definitely sometimes that I wasn't sure it was going to land, but with the help of you know, colleagues like Laura Saunders, who was a long time motivational interviewing trainer, helped me. Like, I was always checking in with her, like, is this MI? Is this MI? Is this really MI? And I think based on my experience, her help, and then some other, people weighing in, it came together pretty well. I'm pretty proud of what's
Mm.
there, and I'm really proud, genuinely proud and humbled by the fact that Bill Miller endorsed it, who's one of the co-founders of Motivational Interviewing, and Steve Hayes endorsed it, who's one of the founders of acceptance and commitment therapy. And to me, that's like, whoa, like, whoa, I just wrote a book that people actually think is pretty solid. It's
Yeah.
kind of a big deal for someone who never thought they would write a book and left a faculty role because they hate writing. So it's kind of, you just got
Yes,
to
it's
find, I, Stan, I think I found my path, right? It's like it took me a
that's right.
while, but but
Yeah.
it's very yeah, it's been an interesting journey from that angle too.
Yes. No, I noticed Stephen Hayes and Bill Miller and Jill Stoddard, who you mentioned before. There was a number of
Yeah,
people who wrote some very lovely comments, and also the book is very well regarded just amongst our Mint community, motivational interviewing network of trainers
that's so
community.
sweet.
People are talking
Yeah.
about it and feel I think it's really made a great contribution. But you were saying there, yes, it is interesting with MI that the old saying. The great sage knows that their job is done when the crowd turns away and says, "We did it ourselves." And that's kind of what MI is, isn't it? Oftentimes we really want the person to, kind of wander off from the conversation, really feeling and owning the choices that they've made and
Hmm.
that sort of thing. And that sort of can, I guess, be conveyed in a self-help book where the person is, well, certainly hearing your voice through the pages, and that there's a kind of a
Hmm.
compassionate I mean, it's a lovely tone. It's personable. It's humorous. It's
Thank you.
caring. It's compassionate. So there's this sort of voice there in the book that kind of is inspiring. But then there's their own compassionate voice that comes into that conversation and starts to make these sort of choices to sort of change or to try to do something different. You mentioned some of the more technical bits. I wondered if I could kind of describe a sort of a scenario, a person struggling with change, and see if you could, just sort of thinking about the book and what such a person might do to go through their own journey towards making personal change and so
Sure.
on. Would that be a way to do it?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Well, I'm thinking of someone who, and I'm riffing off that idea before about the Insta Reels, because I'm thinking of someone who, let's say they work, they've got a full-time job, um, which they're okay with. They don't sort of, love it perhaps, um, but they're anxious and they experience a lot of anxiety. They've started to, really not go out very much. In fact, they're now a bit more stuck at home. They tend to feel very nervous socially, and so they're not really responding to contacts from friends. They have friends, but when they get a message, they feel they just sort of put it off, and there's a kind of a avoidance slash procrastination there, and they find themselves online. They find themselves
Mm,
watching YouTube, watching shorts or reels, even going on those kind of streaming platforms where they're just sort of kind of lurking a little bit and listening to the
mm-hmm.
conversation of others and staying up very late to do it. And so they're up late
Mm.
at night on their phones watching reels and so on, find it really hard to wake up in the morning and get back to work, often kind of complaining to themselves that they're so tired all the time, but very aware that something's got to change here. Something, that
Mm-hmm.
perhaps if they could just, kind of get their internet sort of usage, kind of a little bit more contained. If they could just go for some walks again and get out and about and do some exercise, if they could just return these messages to their friends. Um, so yeah, there's this person, kind of a little bit
Oh yeah.
stuck, sort of thing. Like what happens next?
Well, I can tell you, so one of the things, and this is where, this shows up in the book, but I'll mention it now. But even as you're talking, I felt it in my chest. I was like, that's a lot.
Yeah,
That meaning that's not that's a lot for you to put on me because but it's more I think about just having compassion and empathy for the person you're talking about. There's a lot swirling around, right? That's just
yeah,
like it feels overwhelming. No wonder why you're stuck. Right.
yeah,
And so that's one of the first places, kind of this validation of this makes sense. Like this makes total sense that you feel stuck because this has been a lot to carry. And so it's hard when you're carrying so much. What do I let drop? And I'm so worried and I don't know where to start. And so I spin and I'm stuck more. And so the book kind of walks through with some of that. There's some of that validation and the self-compassion that's there, and then it thinks, well, okay, let's not pick somewhere yet. Like actually intentionally is like, listen, we're going to do that a little bit later. Let's start by thinking about what's important to you. And one of the things I very intentionally did in the book is I was very intentionally thinking, I'm writing this book that's motivational interviewing tools and techniques, but I want it to be very, very consistent with motivational interviewing throughout. And so one of the things I very carefully did is include options for exercises. So it's not like, here's the values exercise that you need to do. It's no, here's 3 of them. If you want to do all of them, do all of them. If you want to do this one, if the cards feel, and even the values card sort, I give a couple different options. So we start with like, who are you? What drives you? And or when are you at your best self? So there's an exercise called the best self exercise, which relates to values, right? Like what does that look like and who do you want to be? And someone like this, I would imagine, would be thinking back to a time when they were really engaged and energized
yeah.
in
That's
doing all of
exactly.
the things.
It's interesting you say that because this person might say, well, I used to be. I used to be the one people would call if they wanted. I had a trailer, and so I was the one they'd call if they wanted help moving house. Or I had a boat, so
Mm-hmm.
I used to organize camping trips across to Stradbroke Island, which is an island off the coast here. Like I used to organize going out, and I really enjoyed dancing. So yeah, you're right. There,
Mm.
there, there is these little pieces of the person that they do hold dearly. The sort of the memories of when they were, sort of sort of that way more inclined, and
Mm-hmm.
independence probably is the other big value that comes to
Well, that's
mind.
right. So you're drilling down to the values. And for some people that works really well, of the kind of the labeling and the using of language to describe values. For some people it's more visceral. And that image, right? So even as you were talking, I was kind of thinking about, someone dancing and like a little, maybe it's like they're doing the tango, right, or something, or just surrounded by people. And that I give an opportunity in the book to draw out your best self so that you have this visceral idea of what that looks like, and it's also something that you can keep with you. So you can take a picture of it, you can refer to it. It just helps you connect with who you are, right? Or who you want to be, right? And
Mm.
then thinking about, okay, well, there's this gap between where I'm at and where I want to be. Okay, so now I'm aware, and now I'm thinking about, well, but but now what, right? So again, it comes back to, well, that there's a lot. And so we have people, we kind of step it in of breaking it into big chunks or categories, which so I don't know, Stan, if this is a English American term of buckets. Do you guys talk about buckets a lot in
Oh, yeah, that is
down
something.
under?
Yes, we get it. Yep.
Yeah. Like, oh, there's like it's so corporate America. Like when I was at Johnson and Johnson, we were always like, what's in that bucket or what's that bucket? And so I picked up the lingo because I spent a couple years there, and I often talk about buckets. It's like, all right, well, there's the self-care bucket, there's the social bucket, and I let people describe and label it themselves, and we walk you through. There's like little buckets that you can label in the book. And then the next step is like, okay, you label you can also think about it as sometimes, categories, right? As kind of the less cute way than buckets or neighborhoods of change. And now you think about, well, what's bubbling up from those buckets? What are the various behavior changes that I want to or I need to focus on? And you see now it's getting more manageable in some ways, and you're more engaged because you have that visceral, who do I want to be? And it's almost like you could have a conversation. I'm looking, I'm sitting, there's like an empty chair, and I don't, I'm not the kind of psychologist that often does an empty chair technique, but like it works sometimes. Of like, there's my best self. I might even have them talk to me about, well, how do I get there? How did you get there, best self? What used to work for you? And we have an exercise in the book that's called the change master of the past, because oftentimes when people are starting to get ready to change, they're just like so demoralized. The what's wrong with me? I am so flawed that there's no way I'm going to be able to make this change. And then you ask them a question of, well, have you ever been successful at a change before? Or what would that look, what did that look like? And I find inevitably there's some past success for us to have a conversation with. And I imagine someone like you're describing, I mean, not only did they were successful in being that person, but there might have been times where they slipped before and they were able to get back on, and you sort of like talk about that. Well, what did that happen? And then you build self-efficacy around the ability to change. And I think that's one of those powerful things that's related to compassion in a lot of ways. It's just the empowerment of like, yes, I can do this. It's possible, partially by knowing, well, I've done something like it before. And sometimes the people we're working with have exactly done it before, that they've made this change before very successfully, but just forgot about it because they're so demoralized and really beating up on themselves. And so then walking them through, well, what exactly is the behavior that you want to change? In MI, we call this the focus, right?
Hmm.
And so we're walking them through getting to the focus and really drilling down. And then it's like, all right, more of the, okay, but why? And really getting around the motivation and consolidating that of why is this important? And I teach the reader to listen for change talk, which is
Hmm.
any language in the direction of change. And so we do some psychoeducation in the book on that, but I also have them do stuff like record themselves talking about making the change so they could hear it in their own voice and not just have someone preaching at them or lecturing them. It's really just listening to yourself talk about change. We know that from MI science, right? That's, oh my gosh, so powerful. And so that's kind of that's a little bit of how the journey works, but it all starts with, who do you want to be and what's the path to get there? Your path, not my path, not the path that I decided I want to instill upon you or the path that works for me. It's, let's figure out what path works for you.
Yes, I mean, this person I'm thinking of, that was a tricky piece. Was where am I now, and where do I really want to be? And there's sort of like the disappointment gap there almost for this person, where
Mm-hmm.
they're sort of it's disappointing to them, and they feel therefore critical of themselves, and so it is what you said is really important, isn't it? Is to be able to help them connect back in with their own strengths and their own sort of achievements or successes, and to be able to feel affirmed in that way, I suppose, and to
Mm-hmm.
build that sense of self-efficacy and confidence again. This
I,
particular person might say, well, I really do need to put my phone away by 10 o'clock at night.
mm-hmm.
I need to be lights out at 10 o'clock so that I can have enough energy the next day. But it's the only real fun I have. Like work kind of is a drag. I'm kind of at home the rest of the time, and so the internet stuff, especially the streaming stuff late at night, is
Mm-hmm.
the only fun I have.
I'm trying to think about where this would show up in the book. This would probably show up. We do a little bit of tracking in the book, and we guide someone to track throughout their day and look for various moments where maybe it's not the only place that they have fun, or but their mind is telling them that, right? And so then it feels so important. And why would you take away their only fun? But helping them think through, okay, so fun is really important to you. How do we build that back in other ways that are more consistent with your other values and what's important and the other stuff that's important to you? Because it is really hard to say to someone, well, we're going to take away the one thing that you like in life. Right. And I mean, we're talking about screens and staying up late, But, I spent a lot of my career working with alcohol and substance use. And that's, if we're honest, it works, right? It works, and it works it functions until it doesn't. And it's the same thing with the screens. It works on some level. It's kind of it's a nice little break for me when I'm doing it. But if I do it too long, now all of a sudden I've lost really valuable, precious time, either with my family because I'm not present with them, or work, or whatever it is. And this person that you're talking about is staying up late. And so it works on some level until it doesn't. And so helping to validate, well, what is sort of what's that function of that behavior? Okay, I'm finding a little bit of joy. Are there other times in the day where you're finding fun or joy, and figuring out, or do we just kind of, you can't beat them, join them. Fine, let's build in some time earlier in the day, so it's, you still get that connection, at least as a stopgap, as a step on the way to the journey to change, because we know that you don't hit your destination. There's lots of opportunities and paths, and sometimes it's not the first path, it's not the only path. Right. And that's one of those other things that, we walk through in the book, of various options and path towards change and figuring out what works for you. But the main point is staying motivated and engaged in the journey, like we talked about earlier. And I think that's really hard for a lot of people.
Yes, it's that's sort of the ambivalence, isn't it? That we're working with.
Hmm.
People feel two ways about it. I mean, he knows that staying up late on YouTube is kind of is not great for his sort of energy and
Unless
exhaustion
he's watching your channel,
the
Stan,
next
then he
day.
could stay up all
Oh,
night
that's
watching
that's going
Compassion
to
in a T-shirt.
completely reinvigorate him. But he knows it's not good, but he also feels like he likes it. Like it's hard, isn't
Yeah.
it? That's what people are up against when thinking about change. And actually, it's what they're up against when thinking about self-compassion. That they're usually
Hmm.
feeling two ways about it. That most people go, well, I know it is good to, to self-care sort of thing is a good thing. But I don't have time for self-care, or there'll be that kind of sort of
Hmm.
two sides to it, won't there? And I think in the book you explore the change talk, but also the sustain talk kind of ideas.
Hmm. Well, and it's you're right, it's having compassion for that stuck talk, right? Like
Stuck talk.
it makes sense, right? That's like one of my favorite phrases, is it makes sense, right? This makes sense. It's very validating, of it makes sense. I talk often and perennially about my love of sweets and treats. And it's like legitimate. I'm currently on the wagon because I gave them up for the Lenten season. We're recording this during the Lenten season, and I'm not super religious, but I took it as an opportunity. And but it calls to me all the time, and I occasionally will have a little bit of a relapse or behavior. So here's another confession. I Kind bars, which are these bars that are incredibly tasty, and they're chocolate and nuts. They're supposed to be like protein bars, but they're kind of candy bars. And I think I admitted to my husband last night, I think he said something about, oh, you can't have that protein thing. It has like chocolate chips in it. And I was like, oh, well, I've already had a bunch of Kind bars, which are just nuts, like chocolate covered nuts, essentially. But I have some compassion of, well, that's me, and trying to play a trick on and trying to cut corners. And it is really tasty and it makes me feel good in the moment. And if we're really honest, it's not consistent with who I want to be, and I'm really trying to eat healthier, and I'm sort of cheating myself. But it takes a moment of kind of stepping back and having a compassion for some of that stuck talk, or even those
Hmm.
stuck kind of behaviors, right? Like acting in line with a way that we want to change without beating ourselves up. It's going to make sense. We are rational human beings, and this individual who's staying up late, it makes sense, right? They're lonely, and so they're getting, not only is it fun, but there's some sense of connection in the YouTube or in the Instagram, or I mean, that's part of why I love it. Is it's so hard to watch those reels and not like laugh and even like happy cry, like all of the wedding. I mean, it is an engaging experience, and it's built that way. So here's the other thing, right? This is sort of an aside, but as a behavior scientist who's worked in health tech, it's built to be addictive,
Yeah.
right? And so when you also have this compassion and some validation of like, well, it makes sense that you get stuck because it's built to stick you, right?
Mm.
And so how do we game the system in a way that works for you and works with you and works with your best self of who you want to be, as opposed to just laying down and resigning to it.
Mm.
So this is another point that I bring up in the book as well, but bring up very regularly. I love acceptance and radical acceptance. I think it's an important feature of the work we do. And it's another one that I get pushback on sometimes from individuals too. And I often have to say, listen, we are not resigning. It's not like it's okay that your mother-in-law is a terrible human being. And that's who she is. Like, we're not going to change that. So it's this acceptance of who she is, so that every time you come up against her, you're not frustrated by it. You're just like, oh, there it is. There she is. There's that. Oh, you are so on brand. Bravo. Like, good job. Right. And it's just, and then you kind of have this irreverence with it and irreverence with life. And it manages and regulates your mood and your thinking, and you can make more wise-minded decisions, which is why I include wise mind in the book very clearly, because I thought it just was such an important part of the behavior change journey for a lot of people.
Yes, no, there's heaps in there as well. I think isn't it funny that they call them kind bars? Even that is, you can sort of see, like that it sort of just plants this seed. Oh, it's actually kind of me to use to eat this particular chocolate and nuts. Um, but yeah,
Very
being
tasty.
being kind to ourselves when, in understanding just how the system works and how our brains respond to it, and sometimes I'll be scrolling through Insta Reels and it's like, what am I doing this for? This is puppies, and you're back in there
Exactly.
because
Yes.
suddenly the algorithm presents you something that hooks you back in. So the kind of the
Yeah.
acceptance, the validation and empathy really for what it's like to be human and to have these struggles, and the way that we kind of suffer, and yet the way that often our brains kind of keep us hooked in. I mean, I suppose the sort of validating the stuck talk, the stuck thoughts,
Hmm.
and elaborating upon the change talk, I guess, these arguments for change, and then is there something there then about commitment? Is that partly where you get to in the book?
I think eventually, yeah, absolutely. You get in the book there. I walk people into the journey of like committing to a particular change, and an initial. So even it's funny. I just even have this hesitation of like, oh, people hate committing to stuff, and so it's I try and keep it very light and very flexible, right? So that you might make an initial commitment, and it might feel like something you want to go after, and then you collect some data, so there's like observing or doing some, what we might call behavioral experiments, but like just going out and doing some stuff and figuring out what you like. And then you might change it. You might change your target or your commitment, and that's okay. Or you might go off down a journey and you're like, oh, actually, there's this other thing that's in my way that I want to work on first. And that's why with the person you're describing, part of me is thinking, I don't know where to start with them. I don't know. I don't, but it's not my life. And so they've got to figure out where do they want to start. And I might, as an experienced clinical scientist, have an idea of what might work best for them. And listen, as a human, I might worry about them, right? I hate when people aren't sleeping. That's like something I really, I always want them to sleep. It's so unhealthy in so many different ways, but that's my fixing reflex. So I'm going to own that. But I'm going to help them figure out an initial starting point, maybe two, right? So we know that MI sometimes works with multiple targets, but really trying to just initial. And it's not like you have to commit, but just try it out and see where it goes and have some compassion for that journey and that process, because it might work. That might be exactly what you need. And there might be something else behind it or
Mm.
under it. And I'm always thinking about, you know, not just how do we like fix something or the treatment for something, but it's also prevention. And sometimes what caused a behavior initially isn't what's maintaining it, and people don't always notice that until they go to change it,
Mm.
right? And I think that's one of those things is we just have to be open and aware and be willing, right? There's this willingness to really just kind of engage in the process. And
Mm.
I think just it is really hard. And so I end the book with sort of saying like, hey, this actually isn't the end. this is really just the beginning of whatever the next step is, and it might mean you go back to the beginning, and I also built the book in a way very intentionally so you could flip around. Because I don't know about you, Stan, but I generally very rarely read a book, except it's a novel. But other books like these, like self-help or other, I barely ever go start to finish, right? You're like flipping around. Oh, that's kind of interesting. And you're reading different parts. And so I wanted it to be kind of modular and someone to be able to use it that way in a way that makes sense for them and where they're showing up. And kind of like a choose your own adventure. In fact, that was one of the titles that I had, choose your own behavioral adventure.
Oh yeah, that would have been a good one as well. Yes, this particular person, I think, probably decided to, sort of respond to a friend's text. I think that's where they began, and it was funny because they went ahead and did that, but of course the friend then immediately responded again, and so then now
Yeah.
it's sort of now I,
Yeah.
but building upon that and meeting for coffee next and so on. But yes, it's difficult, I guess, and just that's where compassion fits in, I suppose, is where we're sort of trying to take a compassionate kind of approach to ourselves and really tap into that compassionate motivation, that it's about being compassionate and sort of seeing that life is difficult, there is suffering. What can I do for myself to kind of try to be helpful?
Hmm.
Lots of barriers and stuck points along the way, but we just try to be compassionate towards all of that as well. Um, so I'll let you go in a moment, but what's your plan from here? I guess you've had such a lovely experience of writing this book that you'll write another one. Is that what you're thinking?
Well, there's two.
Okay.
I've been thinking about two. Yeah, well, so truth be told, actually really enjoyed the process in a lot of ways. I wrote the majority of the book and I actually talk about this very sincerely from a lot of my daughter's basketball practices. And so it's
Ah.
kind of this nice way of merging values in a lot of ways where I'm there and she's doing her thing and I have my laptop but I have a couple other ideas of things I would like to do, but my passion, I define it as better access to better care. And so I'm really motivated to increase access to care, which is a real big problem here in the United States, but not
Mm,
just access to crappy care is usually the way I put it, but access to really good evidence-based care. And this was a big move in that direction, right? Is putting motivational interviewing into the hands of many individuals. And so I'd like to continue to do more of that dissemination and implementation work in the work I do. And so I continue to do speaking and workshops and have a couple books. Ideas. I'm still recovering. Writing a book is kind of, writing a book is a really big deal. Um, it was not consistent with my health goals. I actually gained some weight writing the book, so I'm very sensitive to that, meaning that, oh, it took away a lot of my self-care time.
mm,
So I'd like to do other things for now, but thinking about, how to further my mission of better access to better care.
mm. And if people want to be in touch, or where can they sort of find you to hear more of your ideas?
So I own and run the Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Center, which is based in New Jersey and has a location on Long Island, New York as well. And it's cbtcenter.org is a great way to find our center. Pretty easy. But I also spend a lot of my time on LinkedIn. I'm a top voice there. I write often there. I'm always trying to disseminate little kernels or nuggets. And we have a few different social media channels for the center that people can get access to from our website as well.
Yeah, I'll put all of those various links, the book and the center, and even the LinkedIn link,
Thank you.
so that people can have all of that. But Michelle, thank you very much for being willing to offer us your time and your insights on compassion in a t-shirt. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah. There we go. Thank you.
Self-compassion.